There were a lot of rules in deep space. Some of them were written down in official Imperial navigation codes, proper approach vectors, docking protocols, frequency requirements for border crossings, the correct way to file a transit report when you pass through a monitored sector. Roy Nash had memorized all those years ago and followed most of them most of the time, which was about as much as any working cargo captain could honestly claim. Then there were the other rules, the ones nobody wrote down anywhere, the ones you picked up over years of ports and routes and long meals in station canteens, listening to older pilots talk. Rules like never hire a crew member who won't look you in the eye during the interview, or never take a contract that pays too well for what it's asking, or never push through a navigation anomaly at full speed when you could just slow down and check it properly first. Roy followed those rules too, mostly when they made sense to him. The rule about human space was the one he had never been able to fully accept. He had heard it first from his training supervisor, 15 years ago, delivered as a single flat statement between two other pieces of completely practical advice. Do not run your drives above 80% in a congested sector. Do not enter human space. Always file your cargo manifest before you dock, not after. Just like that, sandwiched in between two things that had obvious logical reasons behind them, as if it belonged in the same category. Roy had asked why, the way he always asked why when something did not come with an explanation attached. His supervisor had looked at him for a moment and then said simply, "Because no one who matters has ever suggested otherwise," and then moved on to the next item on the list. Over the years, Roy had asked the same question to maybe a dozen different people. Experienced captains, port authority officers, a retired Imperial navigator who had logged more flight hours than anyone Roy had ever met. He got slightly different answers each time, but they all had the same shape, a short statement that amounted to the rule being the rule, sometimes accompanied by a vague reference to stories, and then a subject change that was just firm enough to make clear the conversation was over. Nobody ever gave him an actual reason. Roy was a practical man. He was not. He would have told you himself, particularly imaginative or given to unnecessary worry. He ran cargo routes for a living. He managed a crew of 7, kept the ship in working order on a budget that required constant creative thinking, and made enough to keep the operation going from one contract to the next. His job was fundamentally about making good decisions with incomplete information, and in his experience, the decisions that kept getting made without any information attached to them at all were usually the ones worth examining. So he had examined this one, and what he found, when he looked at it straight, was that the rule had no foundation he could actually locate, no incident report that explained it, no official Imperial policy designating human space as restricted or dangerous, no navigational hazard listing, just a very old, very consistent habit shared by every captain in the known galaxy, passed down from person to person like a superstition that had somehow never been tested by anyone practical enough to test it. He was looking at the route map in his small office off the main corridor when Frank came in. Frank Cole had been Roy's first officer for 4 years. He was a quiet, steady man who had been flying longer than Roy had, and who had the specific kind of calm that came not from a relaxed personality, but from having already seen most of the things that could go wrong and having made his peace with them. Roy trusted his judgment on almost everything. They had disagreed on maybe 3 things in 4 years, and Roy had been wrong twice. Roy showed him the route. Frank looked at it for a long moment without speaking. His eyes moved across the map slowly, tracing the line Roy had drawn, the standard route that curved around the edge of human territory, adding 3 weeks to the delivery time, and then the shorter line that cut straight through the outer boundary and came out the other side in a fraction of time. Then Frank looked up, and his expression was the careful neutral one he used when he was about to say something he had already decided to say regardless of how it was received. Roy got there first. "I know what you're going to say." "Then you know I'm going to say it anyway," Frank said. Roy leaned back. "It's the outer edge. We're not going deep. Straight line, clean exit. We're through in under a day." Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've met 2 captains who went into human space." He said it simply, without drama. One of them came back. Roy picked up his coffee. "What happened to him?" "He retired, sold his ship, moved somewhere quiet, and stopped talking about anything that happened before about 12 years ago." Frank's voice was even. I ran into him at a port about 3 years back. Bought him a drink. He was friendly enough. But when I asked about the flight, he just looked at his glass for a while and then changed the subject. Frank paused. He didn't seem scared exactly. More like a man who had made a firm decision not to think about something and had gotten very good at it. Roy considered that. And the other captain? Frank looked out at the stars through the small porthole above Roy's desk. The silence stretched out for a few seconds, longer than was comfortable. Nobody knows, he said quietly. Roy looked at the route map. At the short, clean line, cutting through the edge of human territory. At the 3 weeks, it would save him and the contract bonus that depended on early delivery and the completely straightforward logic of the whole thing. Then he reached over and confirmed the course. Frank looked at him once, said nothing, stood up and went back to his station. Roy drank his coffee and watched the stars and told himself it was just a rule with no reason behind it. He almost believed it. The first 30 minutes were completely uneventful. Roy had half expected something to happen the moment they crossed the border. Some kind of signal, or a change in the sensor readings, or at minimum some atmospheric shift on the bridge that would tell him the crew had noticed where they were and were quietly reconsidering their opinions about him. None of that happened. The ship crossed into human space the same way it crossed any boundary line. One moment on one side of an invisible coordinate. Next moment on the other, with nothing in between to mark the difference. The stars looked the same. The readings looked the same. The ship hummed along at cruising speed with the same low vibration it always had, and the bridge crew went about their work with the ordinary quiet focus of people doing a job they had done many times before. Roy sat in his chair and watched the main display and felt, gradually, the specific satisfaction of a practical man whose practical decision was proving him right. 3 weeks saved. Clean route. No drama. Frank had said nothing since they crossed the border, which Roy chose to read as a particular silence of a first officer who was not going to say he had been wrong, but was also not going to pretend he had been right. By the 25th minute, Roy was considering getting a 4th coffee. By the 30th minute, Dr. Lynn Marsh had stopped moving. Roy noticed that the way you notice small wrong things on a ship you know well. Not immediately, not with alarm, but with a background awareness that something in the normal pattern had changed. Lynn was the kind of scientist who was always in motion at her station, adjusting settings, pulling up secondary screens, cross-referencing readings, making the constant small corrections of someone who treated her instruments as a conversation rather than a display. She had been doing all of that for the first half hour. Now she was completely still, both hands on the console, eyes on her screen. Roy watched her run the same sequence a second time, then a third. Each time she finished, she stayed still for a moment before starting again. The way someone stays still when they are not sure they trust what they are seeing. "Lynn," Roy said. She held up one finger, not dismissively, the focused gesture of someone who needed 60 more seconds before they could form a sentence. Roy waited. After a moment, she said, without looking up, "Can you come look at this, please?" It was the please that did it. Lynn did not usually say please when she was asking him to look at routine data. She said please when she needed someone else to confirm that her instruments were not lying to her. Roy walked over. The sensor display she was looking at showed the standard deep space readout for the sector they were traveling through, background radiation levels, gravitational mapping, any objects large enough to register. The gravitational map was what had caught her attention. It was supposed to show the natural contours of space in this region, the gentle curves produced by distant stars and the occasional mass of a planet or asteroid field. Instead, it was showing structure. Not one structure, not a handful, thousands of distinct objects spread across the sensor range in every direction, each one small enough individually that a less careful reading might have missed them entirely. But Lynn had not missed them, because Lynn did not miss things. And now that Roy was looking at the map with full attention, he could see what had stopped her cold. The objects were arranged in a pattern, not randomly scattered the way natural objects scatter. Positioned, deliberately, precisely, mathematically positioned, the kind of spacing that you got when something had been designed and placed rather than formed and distributed. The pattern extended as far as their sensors could reach in every direction, which meant it almost certainly extended further than that. "What are they?" Roy asked. I don't know yet, Lynn said. That's why I ran it 3 times. She pulled up the composition analysis. They're artificial, that's confirmed. The material readings are consistent across all of them, which rules out natural variation. They're old. She pointed at the age estimate on the side panel. The surface degradation pattern puts a construction date somewhere between 200 and 400 years ago. Minimum. Roy looked at the number. 200 years ago, humanity had barely been reaching the edges of their own star system as far as most imperial records suggested. He did not say this out loud because he had already learned over the last 30 minutes to be careful about the things he assumed he knew. Are they weapons? He asked. No energy signatures consistent with weapon systems. Lynn pulled up the activity readings. No energy signatures of any kind. Actually, they're completely passive. Whatever they do it without producing any detectable output. Defense platforms? Nothing in the database matches them. She said it flatly. I've run the comparison against every known artificial structure type in Imperial records. Nothing comes close. She was quiet for a moment. The closest functional description I can give you, based on positioning and the passive nature, is a monitoring network, something designed to observe rather than act. Roy looked at the map again. At the thousands of points spread across the sector in their precise and patient pattern, covering the space in every direction. No gaps, no blind spots that he could identify. He thought about what a monitoring network that old and that thorough would actually mean. It meant that every ship that had ever entered the space had been observed. Every route, every crossing, every captain who had ever made the same calculation he had made this morning and crossed that borderline thinking they were being practical. All of it watched, all of it logged, all of it known. Lynn turned from her screen and looked at him directly. Captain, she said quietly, they know we're here. They've known since the moment we crossed the border. Roy stared at the sensor map for a long time, at the thousands of silent structures surrounding them in every direction with the calm patience of something that had been waiting for centuries and was entirely comfortable waiting longer. He did not say anything for a while. Behind him, Frank had walked over from a station at some point and was looking at the same display. Roy had not heard him get up. When Roy finally glanced sideways, Frank was just standing there with his arms folded, looking at the map with the expression of a man who had made a decision 12 years ago never to be surprised by anything that happened inside this border, and was currently working very hard to keep that decision intact. He did not say a word. He did not need to. Roy had been standing at the sensor display for about 10 minutes when he realized he was waiting for something to happen. He was not sure exactly what he was waiting for. A ship to appear on the long-range scan. Maybe some kind of defensive system powering up. A warning transmission on the emergency frequencies. Something that matched the shape of what you expected when you had just been told that you had been detected inside monitored territory by a civilization that every captain in the galaxy had spent their entire career going out of their way to avoid. Nothing happened. The sensor map showed the same thousands of silent structures it had been showing since Lynn first found them. Passive, unmoving. The ship's instruments continued returning their usual readings. The stars outside the observation window looked exactly as they had looked for the entire journey. The bridge was quiet in a particular way that had been quiet since Lynn made her announcement. Not the comfortable working quiet before, but the hell-breath quiet of 7 people who were all thinking the same thing and not saying it. Roy walked back to his chair and sat down. He looked at the communication board. Clean across every frequency. Nothing incoming, nothing flagged. He looked at the tactical display. No contacts. No movement anywhere in sensor range except his own ship, traveling at cruising speed through a sector that apparently had eyes everywhere and was choosing, for reasons he could not yet determine, not to do anything about it. He was still looking at the tactical display when the communication board lit up. One channel. No warning. No build-up. Just a clear incoming signal appearing on the board, the way a message appears when someone who knows exactly what they're doing decides it is time to make contact. The signal was strong and sharp with none of the static or degradation you got from long-distance transmissions. Whatever was sending it was not far away, or was using equipment that made distance irrelevant. Roy looked at it for 1 second, Then he reached over and opened the channel. Unregistered vessel. This is Earth Monitoring Station 7. The voice was calm and clear and completely ordinary, not robotic, not formal in the way Imperial communications were formal. Just a man's voice, relaxed and professional, the way a person sounds when they have done the same job long enough that it no longer produces any particular stress. You're currently traveling through monitored space without a transit clearance on file. I'm showing your entry point as approximately 40 minutes ago. A brief pause, not awkward, just a natural rhythm of someone reading from a screen. My name is Lieutenant Dan Reeves. How are you doing today, Captain? Roy stared at the board for a moment. How are you doing today? The man had just confirmed that he had been watching Roy's ship for 40 minutes, and his opening line was, "How are you doing today?" "Fine," Roy said, because it was the only word that came to him immediately. "Good to hear," Dan said pleasantly. "So here's where we are. Your vessel entered monitored space without prior clearance, which happens from time to time. Not a major issue. You've got two options from here." He said it the way you explain options to someone who you are confident will make a reasonable choice once they understand them. Option 1. You file a standard transit request through the channel. I'll send you a moment. We process it, and you'll have a clear corridor to your exit point in about 4 hours. Option 2. You turn around, exit the way you came in, and we close the entry log without any further action required. Another brief pause. Either way works for us. What would you like to do? Roy looked across the bridge. Lynn was watching him. Frank was watching him. Every member of his crew was watching him with expressions that ranged from carefully neutral to quietly desperate, and the quietly desperate ones were the majority. He looked back at the communication board. "That's it," he said. There was a short pause on the other end. Not confused. More like the pause of someone who had heard that question before and was deciding how much to put into the answer. "Were you expecting something else, Captain?" Roy considered the question honestly. "Yes," was the truthful answer. He had been expecting something else. He had been expecting whatever it was that had made one captain stop flying and left the other one unaccounted for. He had been expecting something that matched the scale of what Lynn's sensors have found. Thousands of structures, centuries old, covering every point in this space with silent and total awareness. Whatever response matched that picture, he had been unconsciously preparing himself for it for the last 10 minutes. A polite man on a communication board offering him a 4-hour wait, or a U-turn was not it. "I want to ask you something," Roy said. "Go ahead." He kept his voice even. "What actually happens to captains who don't follow the process? Who come in without clearance and don't file the request and don't turn around?" The pause this time was slightly different. Still brief, still calm, but with a quality to it that Roy could not quite name. Not threatening, not dramatic, just the quality of someone choosing their words with a small amount of extra care. No one who has decided not to follow the process has ever been in a position to explain what happened next. Dan said. His tone did not change. Still pleasant, still completely relaxed. "I can tell you that in those cases we do not observe any ongoing movement from the vessel in question after a certain point." He left a moment of space after that. "What I can also tell you is that most captains, once they've had a look at the monitoring network on their sensors, find that the 4-hour wait is a very comfortable option. There's no penalty attached to it. You come out the other side with a cleared record and a valid transit log." Roy sat with that for a moment. No ongoing movement from the vessel in question after a certain point. Said in the same tone you might use to describe a minor navigational footnote. Said by a man who sounded for all the world like someone working a routine communications shift who would clock out at the end of the day and go home and not think twice about any of this. That was somehow the most unsettling part of the whole conversation. Not what Dan had said. How little it had seemed to cost him to say it. Roy reached for the transit request channel without another word, pulled up the form, filled in the vessel registration, the entry point, the intended exit coordinates. Submitted it. "Got it," Dan said, and Roy could hear the quiet click of a keyboard in the background. "You're in the queue. Estimated processing time is 3 hours and 50 minutes. Sit tight, and I'll be back in touch when your corridor is ready." A brief pause. "Is there anything else you need in the meantime, Captain?" Roy looked at the sensor, map one more time. at the thousands of patient structures watching him from every direction. "No," he said, "that's everything. Perfect. You have a good weight." The channel stayed open for exactly one more second, and then closed cleanly. The bridge was completely silent. Roy sat back in his chair and looked at nothing in particular for a while. Somewhere behind him, Frank let out a slow breath. Not quite a sigh, not quite relief, just the sound of a man releasing something he had been holding without realizing it. Nobody said anything. They did not need to. The 4-hour wait settled over the ship like a change in weather. Not uncomfortable exactly, just different. The crew went back to their stations and did the things that needed doing. Routine checks, maintenance logs, the small administrative work that always accumulated on a cargo run and got dealt with during quiet periods. On the surface, it looked like a normal stretch of downtime between one leg of the journey and the next, but nobody was fully relaxed and everybody knew it. There was a quality to the silence on the bridge that had not been there before they crossed the border. The kind of silence where people are thinking more than they are saying, and what they are thinking is not the kind of thing that benefits from being said out loud. Roy sat in his chair and watched the sensor map, and drank his coffee, and did not feel like doing any of the administrative work waiting on his desk. Frank came and sat in the secondary chair beside him about 20 minutes into the wait. He did not say anything immediately. He just sat down with his own coffee and looked at the forward display for a while, the way he sometimes did when he was working something out internally and needed to be near another person without actually talking to them yet. Roy waited. He had learned over 4 years that pushing Frank toward a conversation before Frank was ready to have it produced nothing useful. The man would get there on his own schedule. After a while, Frank said, "I need to tell you something." Roy looked at him. Frank was still watching the display, his expression the same careful neutral it had been for most of the last hour. But there was something underneath it now that Roy did not usually see there. Not quite discomfort. More like the look of a person who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally decided that putting it down is the right move regardless of how it feels. 12 years ago, Frank said, I was first officer on a survey vessel. The captain was a man named Garrett Webb. Good captain. Experienced. Practical in the same way you're practical. Not reckless. Just not interested in rules that didn't come with reasons attached to them. Roy said nothing. He just listened. Garrett made the same calculation you made this morning. We had a survey route, and there was a section of it that went close to human border, and the numbers worked out better if we cut through. He laid it out the same way you laid out to me. Straightforward logic. Minimal time inside the border, clean exit. I said the same things to him that I said to you. Frank paused. He filed the course anyway. Frank turned his coffee mug slowly in his hands. A small, absent movement. The first part was the same as this. We crossed the border. Everything looked normal, and Garrett gave me a look that meant he thought I had been overcautious. Frank's voice was even and unhurried. He was telling it the way you tell something you have rehearsed in your head many times. Not because you practice it for an audience, but because you've gone over it privately so often that the words have worn smooth. Then our science officer found the monitoring network. Same thing Lynn found. Thousands of structures, perfectly positioned, completely passive. We stopped for about an hour trying to figure out what they were. He paused. Then Garrett decided to go deeper. Roy looked at him. Deeper? He said if we were already inside and already logged, we might as well see what there was to see. The science officer was interested. I didn't argue as hard as I should have. Frank was quiet for a moment. We flew inward for about 6 hours. The monitoring network was everywhere the whole time, just watching. Nothing else happened, and I think that made us comfortable in a way we shouldn't have gotten comfortable. He stopped, drank some coffee, looked at the display. Then the science officer called us to her station. Roy waited. At first, none of us could understand what we were looking at. Frank said, the sensor readings were showing something large, but the scale wasn't registering properly because our instruments weren't built to handle numbers that big. It took our science officer almost 2 hours to confirm it was artificial. 2 hours just established that what we were seeing was not a natural object. He said it simply, without emphasis, which somehow made it land harder than emphasis would have. When she finally had the confirmation, she just sat back in her chair and didn't say anything for a while. Roy asked, What was it? A structure. That's the only word that fits. Not a ship. It wasn't designed to move. Not a station, in any sense we had a reference for. Just a structure built into the deep interior of human space. So large that our vessel next to it would have been. Frank paused, searching for the right comparison. You know how when you're in port and you're walking along the docking arm, and there's a large freighter berth on the other side, and even though you know how big your own ship is, standing next to something that size makes it feel small? He looked at Roy. It was not like that. Our ship next to that thing was not like standing next to a large freighter. It was like a grain of dust sitting next to a building. Not a big building, just a building. Roy did not say anything. And it was not alone, Frank continued. Once the science officer recalibrated the sensors to the scale we were dealing with, she started finding more of them, spread across the deep interior at intervals that our sensors could barely span. Each one the same, connected by something. Energy readings we could detect but not measure, running between them like a network. He paused. A very old network. The age readings made the monitoring structures we found near the border look recent. The bridge around them was quiet. Roy was aware that Lynn had stopped working at her station and was listening. He did not look back at her. Nothing happened, Frank said. That's the part one still thinks about most. Nothing hailed us. Nothing powered up. Nothing approached. Those structures just existed in the way that mountains exist, completely indifferent to whether you were there or not threatening because they had no need to threaten anything. He turned his coffee mug again. Garrett stood at the display for about 5 minutes. Then he turned around and said, "Turn us around." That was all he said. And we turned around and flew back to the border, and not one person on that bridge said a single word the entire way. Frank was quiet for a moment. After we got back, I waited a few weeks, and then I tried once to look up what those structures might be. I searched every database I had access to. Imperial science records, exploration archives, independent research logs. He shook his head slightly. Nothing. Not a reference. Not a theory. Not even a question filed by someone else who had seen something similar. Whatever those things are, either nobody else had ever gotten close enough to document them, or anyone who had made the same choice we made. He looked at Roy directly. "The rule isn't superstition," he said. His voice was quiet and completely certain. "It's not sailors' talk, or old stories getting bigger over time. It's every captain who has ever gone far enough inside that border and seen what's actually in there, making the same decision on their own, independently, without comparing notes." He paused. The decision to come back out. The decision not to go further. The decision to never entirely explain to anyone else why. He looked back at the display. That's the rule. That's where it comes from. Not from a regulation or an incident report. From a few hundred individual people across a few hundred years, all reaching the same conclusion by themselves. Roy sat with that for a long time. The sensor map in front of him showed the same thousands of silent monitoring structures it had been showing for hours. Patient, unmoving, watching with the calm and total attention of something that had been doing this for centuries and would still be doing it long after this ship, and everyone on it was a footnote in someone else's records. Roy thought about Garrett Webb. About the 2 hours it had taken a trained science officer just to confirm that what she was looking at was not natural. About a bridge full of experienced people flying back to the border in complete silence, because silence was the only response that felt proportionate. He looked at the transit request sitting in the queue. 3 hours and 20 minutes remaining on the estimated wait time. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold again. He drank it anyway and did not say a single word. The remaining 3 hours passed slowly, not unpleasantly, just slowly. The way time passes when you are waiting for something specific, and there is nothing useful to do in the meantime. The crew settled into it after a while. Lynn went back to her instruments and spent most of the wait taking quiet, careful readings of the monitoring structures, not trying to decode them, just documenting them. The professional habit of a scientist who knew that recording something carefully was worthwhile even when understanding it was currently out of reach. Roy did not tell her to stop. It seemed like the right thing to be doing. Frank stayed in his chair beside Roy and did not say much after finishing his story. Roy did not push for more conversation. There was nothing left to say that the silence was not already covering adequately. They sat together the way people sit together after one of them has said something significant, not awkwardly, just with a shared understanding that the words were done and what came after them needed its own space. The rest of the crew worked or waited in their own ways. Nobody discussed what Frank had told Roy, though Roy suspected that Lynn at least had heard most of it. Nobody asked questions. There was a kind of collective agreement on the bridge, unspoken and arrived at without negotiation, that what they were going to do was sit quietly and wait for clearance and then fly the approved corridor and not do anything else at all. Roy found that agreement entirely reasonable. He spent some of the time looking at the sensor map, not studying it the way Lynn was studying it, not with any analytical purpose, just looking at it the way you look at something when your mind needs somewhere to rest that is not the inside of your own head. The monitoring structures sat in their precise and ancient positions and watched his ship with the same patient indifference they had maintained since the moment he crossed the border. For hours of waiting had not changed them. Nothing he had done or said or thought had produced any visible response from them whatsoever. That was the thing he kept returning to. Not what they were. Not what they were connected to deeper inside human space. Just the quality of the attention they represented. Steady, complete, utterly without urgency. Whatever was behind this network had built it centuries ago and maintained it and watched through it every day since. And the watching itself was enough. No demonstration required. No action necessary. The knowledge that it was there, that it had always been there, that every vessel that had ever entered this space had been seen from the first moment. That was a whole message, delivered without a word. Roy thought about all the captains who had crossed his border over the centuries and felt that message land in the specific way it landed when you understood it properly. He thought about Garrett Webb standing at his display and saying, "Turn us around," with nothing else attached to it. He thought about the retired captain Frank had run into at a port, friendly over a drink, going quiet when the subject came up, having made a firm private decision about what he was and was not going to revisit. He understood both of them better now than he had this morning. The communication board lit up at 3 hours and 47 minutes, slightly ahead of the estimate, which Roy noted without particular surprise. Dan Reeves's voice came through clean and easy, the same relaxed professional tone it had carried from the first moment. "Captain Nash, your transit clearance has been processed and approved. You should be seeing the corridor on your navigation board now." Roy looked at his board. The corridor was already there, a clean line drawn from his current position to the exit point on the far side of human space, marked with precise boundary coordinates and a recommended cruising speed. The authorization stamp at the top of the routing file read, "Approved C. Burns, Earth Transit Authority, Station 7. Below the stamp, in the standard notes field, was a short line of text. "Thank you for your patience, Captain. Safe travels." Roy read it twice. Warm and professional and completely ordinary, the way a note from a transit coordinator was supposed to read, as if the last 4 hours had been a routine processing delay on a routine crossing rather than what they had actually been. Kathy Burns had signed off a transit approval the same way she had probably signed off 100 others that week, and the normalcy of it was so complete that Roy almost wanted to laugh. Almost. He set the routing into the navigation system. "Frank, take us on the corridor." "Yes, sir," Frank said, and his voice was the steadiest it had been all day. The ship moved. Roy watched the sensor map as they traveled. The monitoring structures tracked them the whole way. He could see it in the subtle shifts of the nearest nodes as the ship passed, the network's attention following them with the same unhurried patience it had maintained from the beginning. Not hostile, not warning, just watching. The way something watches when watching is simply what it does, when the watching itself is so deeply built into the fabric of the place that it requires no explanation or justification. The corridor was precise, and Roy followed it precisely. He did not need to tell his crew to stay within the boundaries. Nobody suggested deviating. The navigation officer held the line with a focus and care that went well beyond standard procedure, and Roy respected it without comment because he understood exactly where it was coming from. 6 hours after the clearance came through, Roy's ship crossed the exit boundary and was back in open space. The sensor map cleared. The monitoring structures disappeared from the readout as if they had never been there, replaced by the ordinary deep space readings of an unremarkable sector that contained nothing of note. The ship's instruments settled back into their usual patterns. The hum of the engines sounded the same as it always had. Roy sat back in his chair. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Lynn let out a breath that she had probably been holding for the better part of 6 hours, and the sound of it broke something loose in the room. And gradually the bridge came back to itself. Small movements, quiet voices, the return of the normal working noise that Roy had always found comfortable and that now felt genuinely good to hear. Frank stood up without a word, went to the small galley off the bridge, and came back with 2 fresh coffees. He set one in front of Roy and sat back down. Roy picked it up and drank half of it without stopping. It was the best coffee he had ever had. 3 weeks later, Roy was back at the port where he had picked up the cargo contract. He was sitting at a table in the station canteen, finishing a meal and going through the paperwork for his next run, when a younger captain he knew slightly came over and sat across from him. The captain's name was Greg Howell. Young, confident, the kind of energy that came from being good at the job and knowing it. He had a route spread out on his own tablet, and he turned it to show Roy with the straightforward manner of someone sharing a practical observation between professionals. "Have you ever used a shortcut through the edge of human territory?" Greg asked. "I've been looking at the numbers, and it saves almost 3 weeks on this run." Roy looked at the route. The same line he had drawn himself not long ago. The same clean logic. The same 3 weeks. He set down his coffee and looked at Greg for a long moment. He thought about what to say. He thought about the monitoring network and the transit corridor and Dan Reeves's voice on the communication board. He thought about what Frank had described in the deep interior, and about Garrett Webb saying turn us around, and about a retired captain going quiet over a drink. He thought about all the captains across all the years who had passed the same information forward in the same way, without full explanations, because a full explanation was not theirs to give and would not have conveyed the right thing anyway. "Take the long way," Roy said. Greg looked up from the tablet. "The numbers are pretty clear, though. 3 weeks is a significant." "Take the long way," Roy said again. Quietly, firmly, not unkindly. The same way Frank had said it to him. With the same weight behind it that came not from drama, but from having seen something that changed the calculation permanently. Greg looked at his face. Roy did not look away and did not add anything and did not explain. He just held the same steady look that Frank had once held for him, and he let it do the work that words were not the right tool for. Greg closed his tablet slowly. He looked at Roy for another moment. Then he nodded once, stood up, picked up his coffee, and left. He did not ask why. He took the long way. And somewhere on the other side of that border, at a station that appeared on no imperial map and in no navigation database, Lieutenant Dan Reeves was sitting at his communications console, going through the day's entry logs. He pulled up the file for Roy's vessel, confirmed the exit timestamp, checked that the corridor had been followed correctly from entry to exit, and marked the record complete with few quiet keystrokes. He noted in the file, as he noted in every clean transit file, that the vessel had complied fully with the process. Then he picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and pulled up the next entry in the queue. Another day, another ship that had come in, seen the network, made the right call, and gone home. He marked it complete.